In the Commons debate on Boris Johnson receiving a Partygate fine, Keir Starmer won plaudits for this intervention.
This morning, I spoke to John Robinson, a constituent of the member for Lichfield. I want to tell you his story. When his wife died of COVID, John and his family obeyed the Prime Minister's rules. He didn't see her in hospital. He didn't hold her hand as she died. Their daughters and grandchildren drove 100 miles up the motorway, clutching a letter from the funeral director in case they were questioned by the police. They didn't have a service in the church. John's son-in-law stayed away because he would have been the forbidden seventh mourner. Doesn't the Prime Minister realise that John would have given the world to hold his dying wife's hand, even if it was just for 9 minutes? But he didn't, because he followed the Prime Minister's rules. Rules that we now know the Prime Minister blithely, repeatedly and deliberately ignored.
Yes.
After months of insulting excuses, today's half-hearted apology will never be enough for John Robinson. If the Prime Minister had any respect for John and the millions like him who sacrificed everything to follow the rules, he'd resign.
As Keir Starmer said there, John Robinson is a constituent of Lichfield, which means he's lucky enough to have Michael Fabricant as his local MP. And speaking to GB News, Michael Fabricant hit back.
The saddest thing of all, I think, is the way that Keir Starmer and other politicians have chosen to weaponise the personal tragedies endured by people like John Robinson. And, I would have thought actually that was pretty beneath him.
That was Michael Fabricant, who just last week said Boris Johnson's parties weren't a problem because nurses and teachers had also got pissed in their staff rooms during the pandemic. He provided no evidence for that claim.
Do a deep condition on that wig, first of all, before you come for anyone else's behaviour. Those split ends are looking very, very raggedy. But in terms of this weaponising grief, what a low blow. Right? Keir Starmer was bringing the reality of the situation, the stark contrast between how this pandemic was experienced by the very powerful and how it was experienced by working class people. He was bringing that into sharp relief in the House of Commons by reading that letter. And I'm sure that Johnson and Fabricant and all of that kind of motley crew do a lot to protect themselves from the pesky details of working class suffering. But I want to also specifically commend that constituent for, in the fog and the rage of his grief, so brilliantly articulating how so many of us feel as this scandal unfolds. That response by Fabricant and Johnson, given that this is the reality of the situation, that response that merely bringing these facts into the Houses of Parliament is political point scoring, tells us a lot about how detached they really are from how this is being experienced on the ground. It tells us that to them, this entire scenario is just a game of political point scoring. It's a political game where points are to be scored and missed, but not much else is really at stake. And that's the lens through which they are reading people's very angry and legitimate responses as this scandal unfolds. But if you actually also watch the original segment in Parliament when Keir Starmer read out this letter, it really is something to consider that the line of defense that Johnson used in response to Keir Starmer reading out that letter was to label it a personal attack and to say that Starmer should be focusing on real issues instead of this letter from this constituent, real issues like Russia and Ukraine. That is the definition, actually, of weaponizing grief. Johnson there, as he has routinely done throughout this scandal, weaponized the trauma and the violence that is being experienced by an entire population, bringing it into a conversation where it has no relevance, merely as a way to deflect from his own behavior. I don't think that the Ukrainian population will be particularly impressed or happy with the fact that the occupation of their land is being used in order to try and fob off criticism of the Prime Minister for holding parties and going to parties in the middle of lockdown and then lying to the British public about them. That's a cheap weaponizing of grief, not the mere bringing of the stark reality of this pandemic in full view in Parliament, which is absolutely where it should be.
It's a super important comparison, the way that he has always tried to bring up Ukraine to say, no, don't scrutinize me for this. There are more important things going on. I doubt Ukrainians have too much time at the moment to be annoyed that he's bringing that up in Parliament. Although I suppose maybe some of the people who've come to claim asylum here are watching PMQs, I'm not sure. But what is clear, and what's definitely the case, is it was clear from Keir Starmer's speech that he'd spoken to this guy, John Robinson. Clearly he was aware that this argument was going to be brought up in Parliament to make the point. I imagine that guy had essentially given Keir Starmer permission to do that and felt very well represented by the fact that his story was put forward there to put across how outraged, especially bereaved people, are about how Boris Johnson behaved and how he has responded to him being found out. So it's very difficult to say, oh, it was weaponizing something, it was beneath him, when the person who he was referencing wanted to be used in that way, or wanted their story to be used in that way, I should say. I doubt Boris Johnson, well, you can't get permission from a whole nation of people, but I doubt Boris Johnson has got permission from many Ukrainians to use their plight as a cheap reason, a cheap excuse to move on from scrutiny of his own disgraceful actions.